Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the Stormcast Eternals Knight-Incantor. This one I'll be doing the robes, metal and skin, and any of the alloy accessories. So I begin by putting some of the scale 75 deep blue on the palette, and then we're going to use some of the scale 75 sky blue, and then finally add some of the P3 Morrow white to the palette as well. I'll start by making a mix of the deep blue with the sky blue just to get a nice mid-tone, and then this will be our sort of mid to base colour that we'll use across the robes. So we're going to start by placing our mid-tone on the left hand side of the robe here, and then we're going to feather it back towards the mid and the furthest right part. It's quite a thin mix I've made. There's a lot of water on the palette, so it might look a little bit transparent here, but we want to work in thin layers just so we get a nice smooth transition from the light to the dark. And you can see here I've got it quite thin with a bit of water in the brush, and I'm just dragging the pigment out, feathering the colour sort of out to the side a little bit. We're working, like I said, nice thin layers just so we can build it up and get a nice smooth transition with no sort of grainy brush strokes or anything in it. Patience is pretty key when you're doing blends on robes and cloth and stuff like this, because they end up having quite light colours often in the blends. You don't want to have those marks or anything visible, so really thin, keep them nice and smooth. So while the mid-tone's still wet, we're going to take a little bit of our highlight sort of colour, which will be the sky blue, and we're going to work that in to the left hand side. So this is a wet blending here where we got the original colour underneath is still quite wet, and we're just going to work this colour in to the top left and then build it up as each layer dries. We're going to reapply and then feather it back out again. This is probably the simplest way I think to do sort of robes like this, when you're not using something like an airbrush to just get a nice quick transition down. If you're going to wet blend the colours in, this is a good place to start. So you can see I built up the layers using the sky blue. Now I'm just going to keep placing more to the left just to bring the sort of vibrant, nice, bright colour up. I'm going to start by putting quite a bit on the model on the left there, and then just using the wet part of the brush just to feather the pigment back towards the left hand side. I'm going to take a little bit of the mid-tone with a bit of the sky blue mixed in, just to keep the blend nice and smooth, where I'm adding additional layers of sky blue on the left. So you can see I'm going backwards and forwards between the colours I pre-mixed on the palette, so we've got some of the deep blue mixed in with the sky blue, and I've also just remembered that the arm actually comes off, so it's easier to get into the crease of the robe here just to smooth out that blend. But having the colours pre-mixed on your palette, you can grab the right sort of shade for the right part, and you can see here on the left there's a little bit sort of bottom left of the screen, the robe there, and you can see where the pigment was obviously quite thin, so I'll have fixed that shortly, probably a bit off camera. So again, I'm going back to the leftmost bright part of the robe, adding another layer, just fixing the little bit where I wasn't too happy with the transition. It looks like it still hasn't been fixed there, but that's just waiting for the top layer to dry on it, and then with just a bit of water, I'm just pulling the colour out and blending it in so we get a nice smooth transition. So now we're going to do a bit of work on the grey robes on the model. So what we'll do here is the scale 75 graphite grey mixed with some white, about 50-50, just to get a nice mid-tone, because we've obviously already base coated it with the graphite. And then we're going to do the same as what we've done with the blue robes, except obviously with the grey, and then push it out towards white at the tips. This next blend here, I actually tilt the model too far and go off a little bit off screen, but you can still sort of get the idea of where I'm going with that one. So you want to continue working around the model, just adding in white to this grey, just to get it up to a final white highlight on the ends. There's a bit of a jump forward in the video now where I've just continued doing the mixing in of the white on the robes, and then I've painted in the little black line. The little black line on the is indented into the robe, so it's quite easy to either follow it in with a bit of dark sort of strong wash, or if you've got the sort of control, just paint the little line in because it'll be nice and tidy, and it really sort of pops the bottom of the robe and gives you that little contrast you need. So I put the strong tone or dark tone, strong tone into the little emblem on the chest, and it also tidied up the blend on the robe a little bit because I wasn't too happy with the blue at the back. You can see it's a lot softer now. I just glazed some more blue layers over it, and then did a little final white edge highlight around the corners, and a little dot on each sort of 90-degree angle at the end corner piece as well. I then work on the little vials here. So I base coated them with Caribbean blue, and then I've mixed in some white into Caribbean blue just to highlight the all the edges of the crystal. It's quite sharp, so you can almost get these with the side of the brush. Build up like a opposing highlight in each one. So if you imagine looking at it like a cross, if you put a brighter highlight in the top left one, put a highlight in the bottom right one, then put a shade in the top right one, and then a shade in the bottom left one, so you get sort of an opposing corner going. These were quite awkward to highlight because they're quite small, so I did just go off the middle of the camera there a little bit, and then I'm mixing in some more white in a sec, just to sort of tidy the shade and the highlights. What I did do was actually change the colour of these later on, but I will come back to that when I do it later. The Caribbean blue mix looked too much like the robe, so you've got the nice sky blue robes highlighted up, and you've also got the crystal highlighted up to the almost the same highlight colour, which I wanted to keep it looking a bit more of a spot colour than just blended into the model. So this next bit's quite interesting. So what I'm doing is using the Caribbean blue and some of the deep blue, and I'm mixing it together to get the shade I want for the opposing parts of the crystal. As you can see, I'm adding deep blue, then I'm adding Caribbean blue, then I'm adding a bit more, then white, then back, then I just can't quite get the colour I want. Just by darkening the Caribbean blue, it's not looking right. So I'm going to put some more deep blue in here, as you can see. And then I'm going to add in some more Caribbean blue, and I've actually made a separate mix there because I just wasn't happy with the colour. I just couldn't find what I wanted, so I'm mixing backwards and forwards, maybe up to 10 times here just to get the shade I want. I find this is one of the main advantages for using the wet palette for me, is I can keep all these mixes and sort of colours and then pick where I want to be, add a bit more, take a bit more out, and they stay obviously nice and wet on there for a few days. So if you do change your mind, come back to it, add a different model or something, you can always just pick that colour you want again. And obviously once these little palette things are dried, it's easy to mix the colour on top of it just to get the perfect match again. So don't throw away these little palette papers when you're done. I'll probably do a little side video on these actually when I do the next video, just put a handful of them out so you can see what I mean about mixing the colours again on them. Okay, so I've flipped the palette round, and now I've got some white, some Games Workshop XV88 and P3 Battlefield Brown on the palette. Then I'm going to mix some of the XV88 with some of the white and get a nice mid-tone. So this will be for the sort of mid-highlight on the non-metallic gold, which we're going to start working on now. So before we begin doing our non-metallic gold, we need to add some Scrofulous Brown from Game Color to the palette. This is like a rich yellowy gold, which we're going to add into our XV88. I find that consistency wise on its own it's not great to paint with, but it mixes really nicely into the XV88 base, and then you get a nice strong colour to mix in with the white to get your nice mid-yellow colour. So we're going to go here with the highlights towards the top part of this scabbard on the sort of on the actual holder for the sword. We're going to mix in this colour, like I said, towards the top, and then we can apply the highlights and shades over it afterwards. So we'll take some of the Battlefield Brown and then mix our Scrofulous Brown into that with some of the XV88 to make us a nice sort of mid-dark shade. This will then be the second sort of bottom layer towards the shaded part of the non-metallic gold. So what we're going to end up with eventually is about 5 or 6 different mixed golds on the palette, from a nice bright one right down to a really dark, almost Battlefield brown, you know, mix. And then that will be the shade, and then you can just pick from the colours mixed to get your either highlight, mid or shade from that. So now we'll take some more of our brighter mix and add a bit more white in it, and this will give us the second to final highlight, where the final highlight would be almost pure white. And then we're going to run this along the top part where it'll be brighter, and where more light would hit this part of the metal. It's important to get the brightest colour next to the darkest colour along the highlights, just so that you can get a nice strong contrast. And then what we'll do later on, you'll see this, is we'll highlight the darkest part at the bottom with this brightest colour around the trim, and then you get a nice stark highlight contrast, and then it sort of looks more believable, and that's how you achieve the non-metallic look. So this is also the same approach that I took with the Tidecaster's non-metallic gold. So this will look very similar when finished to the golds that appeared on that model. So now we're going to take just some of the Battlefield Brown, and we're going to thin it with quite a lot of water, and this will just give us a shade. So at the moment you can see it's quite bright, then it's quite mid, then it's quite dark, and the 3 colours are quite distinct. So then what we'll do after this is take our mid colours we picked and then shade between them, sort of feather the colours out so you don't get such a stark transition between them, because you want it to be smooth before the contrast highlights are picked on at the end. So now we've got our shade in place at the bottom. I'm going to use the bright highlight just to edge highlight around the darkest point, and then this sort of makes the contrast pop, and this is how you achieve the look. So I'm going to continue with just placing the non-metallic colours down on the model. So this will be on the little emblems on the robes, on the little bits on the gloves, the lion emblem on his chest, the top of the sword, and then most importantly the little vials and the main weapon itself. So this part of the model here is a good example to see the non-metallic colours from darkest to lightest, because it's a nice big flat smooth surface with no interrupting shapes like the emblems and stuff. So you can see here I've placed the darkest colour at the bottom, I'm going to go with the brightest colour at the top here, and then I'm going to work the colours in and feather them between this point and the darkest point. This will require just some small little wet blends and feathering of colours, and some sort of glazes in there as well, just to keep it nice and smooth. And what you could also do here is add in some little scratches onto this flat surface, just to give the impression that it's a bit worn and damaged. But on this model I've kept everything nice and clean, but I may go back and add in sort of scratches and weathering and damage later on, but for now I just wanted to have a nice clean finish. So you can see with the final white highlights added to the metal and the small dots, you get the nice sort of non-metallic look we were going for. I've done the handle as well on the sword hilt there, just giving it a nice smooth rounded white highlight at the top, just to show that's the brightest point. With sort of non-metallic like this, it's just a case of moving the colours around until it sort of looks right, because it's not a sort of a natural painting technique. It's kind of just, you know, as long as the contrast is there, the lightest points are where the light would hit them, it's quite hard to go wrong with it. So to tint the crystal a slightly different colour, I've used Waywatcher Green. This I've done in 2 thin coats over it, and this changes our already nicely blended Caribbean blue and white to a nice greeny, turquoisey, maybe sort of more towards the jade spectrum. And then once it's dry, I reapply the little small white highlights just to keep them nice and bright and those not tinted green. Using sort of glazes and stuff like this that really strongly change the colour underneath without changing the shades and the highlights is a really good way of sort of alternating colours and parts of models once you've actually put the original base layers in place. I tried with like a pinky purple as well before I went back and repainted it. It didn't look right on the model. It needed to stay in the greeny blue colour to match the blue of the robe, but not so much that it looked the same before when it was Caribbean blue. So you can see here I've continued with the metal and I've finished off all the little emblems and bits on the knee pads and the shoulder and the wrists and everything. Also finished the sword at the back just by highlighting up the black sheaths with the graphite grey, and I've also done the belt just by doing them brown and adding in some white. That was Dubai brown from scale 75. It's just a standard literally base coat with one highlight round it, no fancy blends or anything on it there. So using scale 75 deep red mixed with white, I'm going to highlight the little grip parts of the sword handle and the staff. I went simple with this one and just painted over the small already moulded into the plastic lines. Some of them look a little bit off here, so I went back and tidied them up, but do this in one pass and then just using white go back and dot the corner of each grip just to sort of make them pop and sort of get that more three-dimensional look in there. So using the same technique for the bits I showed on camera, I went ahead and did the rest of the staff and then painted the gem on both sides of it, like the stone with the same colours to match the vial in exactly the same way, because they're they're the cross shape, so you can get the shades opposing in opposite corners. And then I did the back of the neck plate, sort of head plate bit as well with the same colour gem. So for the most part that is the model finished, other than the head. So we're going to start off by painting the skin with a scale 75 pink flesh. And we're gonna do 2 coats of this because it's been thinned quite a bit, because I want to keep all the detail on the face. So you want to keep your colours nice and thin as well, because there's a lot of detail on these new Stormcast heads, and you don't want to obscure it with thick paint. So while the head's drying, I'm going to take a cocktail stick and then pick out the bit of blue tack that I put in the hole where the head sits, just to keep a nice tight fit, because I didn't want any extra layers of paint obscuring the hole where the head sits. So this, I'll just pick this out and give it a nice tight flush fit when it's painted up. So I gave the head 2 coats of Reikland Flesh Shade from Games Workshop, just to get nice in those recesses to get our shades down. And then I'm taking the pale skin mixed with pink flesh, both scale 75 again. There's barely any pale skin added in to this pink flesh. It's literally just there to slightly brighten the colour. And then I'm going to go over and start painting in all the highlights, so the ears, the nose, around the eyebrows, tops of the cheeks, top of the forehead. So when I'm painting the top of the head, I've got a lot of water in the brush, and I'm just pulling the pigment towards the top sort of central point of his head where it'd be a bit brighter, because I want to keep the head darker towards the sides and the back, because that'll obviously be in his helmet, or not in the helmet, the armor plate around the back of his head, and then just build this up in thin layers just to keep it nice and bright towards the top, but not too thick. So as these first sort of layers of highlights dry, I'm going to add more pale skin into the mix, and then wait for them to dry, then add in more pale skin, and then again more pale skin, right up until the point where we get to pure pale skin, with a tiny bit of white in, just to do like the tip of the nose and tops of the ears, and a little bit on the cheek, just to give you those little bright pinpoint highlights. This bit's very samey, backwards and forth, just adding in the colours. And I built up some little highlights on the ridge of his forehead there, and then once this is done, I move on to the beard. So we're going to paint the beard scale 75 Dubai brown. I was going to go with black for this, but I decided if I went with Dubai brown, I could add in sort of greys and whites into the beard to make it look like he's still young enough to have like a brown beard with grey in it, but yeah, I didn't want to do it completely black to sort of show that it's a yeah, he's a proper old man beard. I also painted the head sort of strap around the back of his head with the same colour, and then taking our graphite grey from scale 75 again, and then just painting small little lines all around the beard and the moustache, just to start working in those colours. I then added white into our graphite grey mix, just to put in some slightly brighter colour into the beard. Didn't want to completely paint over the grey we've done before, just more sort of a thin highlight over the places we just went with the grey before, but leave some of it showing to get that colour variation. And one thing I didn't show on camera here was I did the same thing for the eyebrows. Originally I just painted the highlights onto the eyebrows, but then realised that I actually wanted to do them coloured, so I base coated them Dubai brown, and then graphite grey with white, and then finally some tiny little white sort of dots at either end just to highlight those up. I also painted the eyes for the model as well. I did this off camera because it's so fiddly to try and paint pupils and irises on camera, so what I'm going to do is like a larger scale sort of bust model, so I can show like really good detail on eyes and faces on one of those. It would just be a nice project to do, and then it'd be a bit easier to see. So the model was pretty much done at this point. I placed the head in to the socket where we took the blue tack out of, and popped on his base. I put some pigment down on the base and some tufts. I think for my army when I do this, I'm going to change the basing up, but for now I just wanted a reasonably simple base that showed off the miniature and didn't take too much away from it with having, you know, wacky colours or anything on the bases. I hope you enjoyed this video. Sorry it took a bit of time to get the second part out, but I've been super busy with trying to get ready for a tournament and getting up to Nottingham to get my stuff into the Golden Demon exhibition, which I made a post on yesterday. But you know, if you get a chance, check that out. It's I'm really proud to have it in there. I worked for 7 months painting the model, so it's really good to hear some feedback on it if you do get a chance to see it in person. So I do have some resin models that I'm probably going to do some videos on soon on how to prepare resin and how I go about sort of, you know, gap filling and everything for it and doing the sculpting work. There's some big demon models that I picked up at Adepticon, so hopefully I can do something fun with those. But you know, thanks for the support so far, and I really hope you enjoyed the video. And as always, you know, have fun painting your models, and if you got any feedback, I'd you know, really appreciate it. Thanks, bye.